It was a quiet evening in the small town, the kind of evening where the streets were calm, and the sky was a perfect shade of purple as the sun set. The kind of evening where nothing seemed out of place. A perfect night, or so it seemed for James Harris, a retired black veteran who had served his country proudly. He had just finished a long day at work and was driving home, looking forward to a peaceful evening. But tonight would not be like any other. James turned onto his street, the soft hum of his car engine the only sound breaking the silence of the night. The streets were empty. As he drove past his neighbors' houses, he noticed the soft glow of porch lights and the distant sound of someone laughing from a house a few blocks away. Everything seemed peaceful, normal. But then, out of nowhere, flashing blue and red lights lit up the rearview mirror, startling him. A police car was behind him, sirens blaring. James's heart skipped a beat. He had done nothing wrong. He hadn't broken any laws. So why was the police car pulling him over? He slowly eased his car to the side of the road and turned off the engine. The officer stepped out of the car, his figure tall and rigid under the lights of the patrol car. James watched as the officer approached his vehicle, his face unreadable. "Good evening, sir," the officer said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Can I see your license and registration?" James was calm. He had been stopped by the police before, but this time felt different. Maybe it was the way the officer had walked up to his window. There was an odd stiffness in his movement, like something wasn't quite right. James handed over his documents without saying a word, trying to stay composed. The officer took them, scanning them quickly before looking back at James. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, then said, "Please step out of the vehicle, sir." James frowned. This wasn't a normal request. In all his years of driving, he had never been asked to get out of the car during a routine stop. He looked the officer in the eyes, trying to read him. But the officer's face gave nothing away. "Is there a problem, officer?" James asked, his voice calm but with a hint of confusion. "I said step out of the car," the officer repeated, his tone sharper this time. James was taken aback. There was no reason for him to step out of the car. He hadn't done anything wrong. His mind raced as he wondered if he had somehow been mistaken for someone else. But he didn't argue. He opened the door and stepped out of the vehicle, keeping his hands where the officer could see them. As James stood there, he felt a wave of unease settle in his stomach. Something wasn't right. The officer's eyes were hard, and there were now 2 more patrol cars pulling up behind them. James glanced around, his instincts telling him to stay alert. He could feel his heart beating faster. "Is there a problem, officer?" James repeated, his voice more serious now. "I've done nothing wrong." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he motioned for James to turn around and put his hands behind his back. "You're under arrest," he said. James froze. His mind raced, and for a moment, he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Arrested? For what? He had done nothing wrong. His heart started to pound in his chest, and a cold chill ran down his spine. Arrested? For what? "I haven't done anything," James said, his voice shaking now. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he roughly placed handcuffs on James's wrists and led him to one of the patrol cars. James struggled to understand what was happening. Why was he being treated like this? He had served in the military for years, fought for his country, and now he was being arrested for no reason at all. As they reached the car, James turned his head to the side, trying to look at the other officers standing nearby. They weren't saying anything either, just watching him. He didn't see any signs of a reason for this arrest. No probable cause, no explanation. His mind raced with questions, and anger began to bubble up inside him. What kind of country was he living in if this could happen to him? "What's going on here?" James demanded, his voice growing louder. "You can't just arrest me like this." One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped forward and snapped, "Keep quiet, or we'll add resisting arrest to the charges." James's chest tightened. Resisting arrest? He hadn't even been told why he was arrested in the first place. He was confused, scared, and now he could feel his anger turning into frustration. As they shoved him into the back of the patrol car, he tried to steady his breathing. His mind raced. What was going on? Why was he being treated like this? He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random traffic stop. Something was off. It was too sudden, too harsh, too unjust. He had been arrested before, but this felt different. This wasn't just an ordinary mistake. It felt deliberate. In the back of the patrol car, James leaned his head against the window, staring out into the night, trying to make sense of everything. His thoughts were scattered, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Something had gone terribly wrong, and he wasn't going to just sit back and let it happen. As the car drove away from the scene, James couldn't help but wonder, was this the beginning of something much bigger? Why him? And what was going to happen next? The night was far from over, and James had no idea that this was just the start of a fight that would change everything. James sat in the back of the police car, his mind racing. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, but the real pain was the feeling of injustice that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. He had done nothing wrong, nothing at all. His thoughts raced back to the quiet evening he had been having, the peaceful drive home. Now he was trapped, being taken somewhere without even knowing why. The patrol car turned a corner, the engine humming louder than his racing thoughts. James tried to focus, tried to calm himself, but the frustration and confusion only grew. His mind was a blur. The officer hadn't given him any reason for the arrest, no explanation. It wasn't right. It couldn't be. James knew the law. He knew his rights, and yet here he was, wrongly detained. The anger inside him started to bubble up, but he forced himself to stay quiet. He had to think, to plan. There was no point in fighting back now. He had to find out what was really going on. After a few minutes of driving in silence, the car pulled into the police station. James's heart pounded. He was ushered out of the car, the officer's hands rough on his arms as they moved him toward the holding cells. He noticed the looks they gave him, unfriendly, even mocking, as if they already assumed he was guilty of something. "Why am I being arrested?" James asked again, this time with a little more force, but his voice still calm. "I haven't done anything." The officer who had arrested him didn't answer. Instead, he shoved James into the small, dimly lit holding cell. The door slammed shut behind him with a loud metallic sound, and James found himself alone, still handcuffed, still confused. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He couldn't let them break him. This was wrong, and he had to stay strong. He looked through the small barred window of the cell, but all he could see was the dark hallway outside. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, buzzing in the stillness. Minutes passed like hours. James sat on the hard bench, his mind spinning. Why had they done this? Why now? The questions kept coming, but the answers remained out of reach. Then, a few minutes later, the door opened again, and another officer stepped inside. This one was younger, his face tense, but less rigid than the first officer. He stood in front of James, not saying a word at first. James looked up at him, desperate for any kind of explanation. "You've got the wrong man. This is a mistake. I'm a veteran. I've served my country. You can't just do this." The officer didn't seem to care about the plea. His eyes darted over to the other officers standing outside the cell. There was a moment of quiet before he spoke, his voice low. "Just sit tight. We'll figure this out soon enough," he muttered, not looking James in the eye. Then he turned and walked away, leaving James with more questions than ever. The seconds felt like minutes. James stared at the cell door, hearing nothing but the sounds of his own breathing. The fear started creeping in, but he fought it. He couldn't let it take over. He needed answers. Suddenly, the phone in the small guard station across the hall rang. The officer picked it up, speaking in low tones, but James could still make out bits of the conversation. It sounded serious. There was talk of a higher-up coming in to investigate. A name that James didn't recognize was mentioned. And then something that made his heart skip. The Pentagon. What did the Pentagon have to do with this? What was going on? Why was this arrest so different? James's mind raced. He had been a soldier, yes, but he had never been involved in anything this big, this important. The mention of the Pentagon had shaken him to his core. Could this be part of something larger? His thoughts were interrupted when the door opened again. This time, the officer who had arrested him stepped in, followed by another figure in a suit, someone James had never seen before. The suit seemed out of place in the prison-like setting. The officer was all business. "You're being held on suspicion of involvement in an ongoing investigation," he said coldly. "You'll be processed soon." Processed? James didn't understand. He wasn't even being told what the charges were. He was being treated like a criminal, yet no one would explain why. The man in the suit didn't say anything more. He just stood there, watching. James's heart began to race again. Was this some kind of setup? What did the Pentagon have to do with him? The officer turned and left, locking the door behind him. James was left alone with his thoughts again, each one more terrifying than the last. He knew something wasn't right. He knew this wasn't just a simple case of mistaken identity. Whatever was happening, it was far bigger than him. And it was only just beginning. Time seemed to move slowly in the holding cell. The walls felt like they were closing in around James. He had been sitting there for what felt like hours, his mind spinning in confusion. He tried to remain calm, but the longer he waited without any answers, the more restless he became. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, their buzzing the only sound in the small, lonely space. He kept thinking back to the moment he was arrested, the way the officers had treated him, the strange lack of explanation. There was something more to this, and James had a sinking feeling in his gut that this was no ordinary mistake. Suddenly, the door to his cell opened again. A guard stepped inside, holding a phone in his hand. "Phone call for you," the guard said, his tone flat. "You've got 1 minute. Make it quick." James stood up, surprised. A phone call. Who could it be? His heart raced with a flicker of hope. Maybe someone was finally coming to help him. He had no idea who it could be, but he couldn't waste the opportunity. The guard motioned for James to step forward, and as he did, James's mind raced. His family, a friend. But no, the last person he would expect was the one who answered the phone. He took the phone, and as soon as he did, a voice came through the receiver that he hadn't heard in years. "James, it's me, Marcus." It was Marcus, an old military buddy, someone who had been close to James during their service. Marcus had connections that James had no idea still existed, and what Marcus said next would change everything. "You need to stay calm," Marcus said, his voice low and urgent. "Listen to me carefully. You're in trouble. Big trouble." James's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean? I've done nothing wrong. I don't know why I'm here. Why am I being arrested?" "I know," Marcus said, and there was a pause. "I don't have much time, but I'm going to help you. I've already made some calls. There's a reason they've targeted you, James. This isn't just a random stop. It's bigger than you think." James's head spun. What was Marcus talking about? "What do you mean? Who's behind this?" Marcus's voice dropped even lower. "The Pentagon is involved. I don't know the details yet, but your arrest is tied to something much bigger. There are people who don't want you to know the truth, and they've got the power to make it disappear." James's heart pounded. The Pentagon. His mind couldn't wrap around it. He had never been involved in anything like this. The thought of being tangled up in something this dangerous was overwhelming, but at the same time, a small spark of hope ignited inside him. Someone was finally taking action. Someone was trying to help. "I'll do what I can from here," Marcus continued. "But you need to hang on. Don't trust anyone in that precinct. They don't have your best interests at heart. I'll get back to you as soon as I can." Before James could respond, the call ended abruptly. The guard came over, snatched the phone from his hand, and quickly left the cell without saying another word. James stood there, the weight of the conversation sinking in. The Pentagon. What was going on? Why would the Pentagon be involved in his arrest? The question swirled in his head, and the fear he had tried to push aside now surged back. This was no ordinary case. This was something far more sinister. But there was also a glimmer of hope. Marcus was in his corner. Someone had his back, and that meant everything. He walked back to the bench in his cell, trying to steady his breath. He had no idea what the next step would be, but for the first time since his arrest, James felt a small spark of determination. If the Pentagon was involved, there had to be a reason, and he wasn't going to sit back and let them decide his fate. He knew one thing for sure now. This was just the beginning. Whatever happened next, he wasn't going to let them win. He was going to fight, and with Marcus's help, maybe, just maybe, he could uncover the truth and clear his name. But the path ahead was uncertain, and the real battle was just starting. James paced back and forth in his small holding cell. His mind was still reeling from the phone call with Marcus. The words Pentagon and bigger than you think echoed in his head. What had he gotten into? Why was he suddenly the center of a web that reached all the way to the highest levels of government? Minutes turned to hours, and still no one came to explain anything to him. The officers outside seemed to be ignoring him, acting like he wasn't even there. They were waiting for something. But what? And who exactly was waiting for him? Just as he was about to lose hope, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. James's heart skipped a beat. Someone was coming. Was it another officer, or had Marcus come through with some kind of miracle? The door to his cell swung open, but it wasn't an officer who stepped inside. Instead, a tall man in a sharp suit walked in, his presence immediately commanding attention. The man's face was calm, his expression unreadable, but his sharp eyes never left James. "James Harris?" the man asked in a voice that was calm, yet authoritative. James nodded, confused but hopeful. "Yes, that's me. Who are you?" The man smiled slightly, as if he expected the question. "My name is David Harper. I'm here to help you." James blinked, taken aback. "Help me? But who are you really? Are you with the police?" Harper shook his head. "No, I'm not with the police. I'm here on behalf of people who are much higher up than anyone here at this precinct." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. The Pentagon, actually. James's stomach tightened. The Pentagon. The same name Marcus had mentioned. The same shadowy, powerful organization that seemed to be at the heart of everything going wrong in his life right now. "What do you mean, the Pentagon?" James asked, his voice shaky with a mix of disbelief and fear. Harper looked around the small cell, making sure no one was listening before he spoke again. "I've been following your case. Your arrest was no accident. You were targeted because of your military background. Someone, or some group, wants you out of the picture. They have resources, they have power, and they've been pulling strings." James's head spun. He was being targeted. But why? What had he done to deserve this? "But why me?" James asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "I didn't do anything wrong. I've never even been involved in anything like this." Harper's eyes softened, but his face remained serious. "That's exactly why you're being targeted. You're an innocent man with a clean record, but you're also someone who could uncover something dangerous, the kind of thing people would go to great lengths to hide." James felt the blood drain from his face. "What kind of thing? What are you talking about?" Harper leaned in, lowering his voice. "There's a conspiracy here, James. It goes beyond you. Someone is using their power to cover up something big, something that could shake this whole system to its core. and the people behind it won't stop until it's buried. James felt a chill run through him. He was just an ordinary man, a veteran who had served his country faithfully. He never imagined being involved in anything like this. But now, everything had changed. He had been dragged into something much bigger than himself. "So what happens now?" James asked, his voice quiet. Harper stood up straighter, his tone firm. "Now, you stay strong. You don't back down. We're going to make sure the truth comes out, no matter what it takes. But we need to be careful. The people who did this to you, they have resources. They'll do whatever they can to silence you." The air between them was thick with tension, but for the first time since his arrest, James felt a spark of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight. Someone with power, someone with connections was on his side. But even as hope filled him, a cold reality set in. This wouldn't be easy. There would be dangers ahead, things far beyond his control. Harper stepped toward the door of the cell, his voice low as he turned back to James. "I'm going to make sure they don't get away with this. I'll be in touch soon. Just hold on. You're not forgotten." As Harper walked out, the door closing softly behind him, James stood still, letting the weight of the situation settle in. He wasn't just a man in a holding cell anymore. He was a part of something much bigger, something dangerous, but he was ready to fight. Harper's words lingered in his mind. "You're not forgotten." For the first time since his arrest, James felt like he wasn't entirely powerless. But as he sat back down on the hard bench, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the calm before the storm. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to be easy. James sat in the cold, dimly lit holding cell, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. David Harper's words echoed in his mind over and over. "You're not forgotten." But the questions kept coming. What was Harper's true agenda? Why had the Pentagon taken such an interest in him? And most of all, how could he possibly survive this storm that was coming? The hours dragged on, and it felt like the walls of the cell were closing in tighter with every passing second. He tried to keep his thoughts focused, but the reality of the situation kept pulling him back to the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Then, just as he began to lose hope, the door to the cell opened again. This time, it was not the usual guards, but Harper, the man who had promised to help him. But something was different about him now. His eyes were darker, more serious, like he was carrying the weight of something heavy. "James," Harper said, stepping inside, his voice low. "It's time. The plan is in motion." James stood up immediately, his heart racing. "What plan? What are you talking about?" Harper glanced around the cell to make sure they were alone before leaning in closer. "I've made some calls. I've reached out to a few people who can help get you out of here. We got one chance to turn this around, but we have to move fast." James could feel the tension in the air. "Who's helping me? Who's on our side?" Harper's face hardened. "A few powerful people who know what's going on, but they can't act openly. Not yet. We have to be careful." The words "we have to be careful" sent a shiver down James's spine. He didn't know who he could trust anymore. Everyone seemed to have their own agenda, and he was stuck in the middle, trying to navigate a system that was stacked against him. "Why didn't you tell me about this sooner?" James asked, his frustration growing. Harper held up his hand, signaling James to lower his voice. "Listen, I can't explain everything right now. The less you know, the better. But I'm here to get you out. I've arranged for a transfer to a different facility, one that's not under the control of the precinct that's holding you. We'll have a brief window to make our move, but it's all on you to stay calm and not give them any reason to stop you." James tried to digest this new information. His mind raced. A transfer to another facility. It sounded like a way to get him out temporarily, but it also raised more questions. If they were trying to silence him, wouldn't they just move him to a more secure location? Was this part of a bigger game he didn't yet understand? "I don't understand," James said, his voice tense. "Why me? Why is this happening? What do they want with me?" Harper's expression darkened as he stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper. "You were in the wrong place at the wrong time, James. Someone saw you as a threat. Not because of anything you've done, but because of what you could uncover. They're making sure you can't do that." The weight of Harper's words hit James like a punch to the gut. He'd always thought of himself as an ordinary man, someone who had served his country, someone who had put his time in. Never in a million years had he imagined that he could be part of a conspiracy of this scale. "So, what do we do now?" James asked, finally beginning to realize the danger he was in. He had no idea who he could trust, but it was clear that Harper wasn't his enemy. For now, at least. "We move quickly," Harper said, his tone sharp. "You'll be transferred in the next few hours. We need you to act like nothing's wrong. Keep your head down. Don't let anyone know that you know what's really going on." James nodded, the realization hitting him hard. He was about to be part of something much bigger than he ever imagined, and every step he took from here on out could determine whether he survived this or not. As Harper turned to leave, James caught his arm. "Wait. What happens if they don't let me go? What if they stop us?" Harper paused, looking back at him with a hard expression. "Then we'll make them listen," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "The truth has a way of coming out, James, and when it does, everything will change." With that, Harper walked out, leaving James alone once again with his thoughts. He knew the stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about uncovering a truth that could destroy everything. He took a deep breath and ran his hands through his hair. His heart pounded in his chest. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, James was ready to fight, to survive, and to make sure the truth came to light. The cell door creaked open once more, and James's heart skipped a beat. He had been waiting for this moment, his mind racing with possibilities. The time had finally come. The transfer Harper had promised was underway. But as he stood up, something deep inside told him that this wouldn't be as simple as walking out of here. The guard who entered the cell wasn't the usual one. He was taller, with a blank, unreadable expression, and he didn't say a word as he unlatched the handcuffs from the wall. James kept his eyes on the man, trying to figure out who he was and whether he could trust him. "Let's go," the guard said gruffly, gesturing for James to follow. James's pulse quickened as he stepped forward, the chains around his wrists clinking softly in the quiet hallway. This was it, the first real step toward getting out of this mess. But a gnawing sense of unease gnawed at him. Nothing about this felt right. They moved through the cold, dimly lit corridors of the facility, and James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every footstep echoed in the narrow hallways, and every turn they made felt more suspicious than the last. Where was Harper? Why hadn't he shown up to oversee this transfer? As they approached the heavy steel doors at the exit of the holding area, the guard stopped and nodded to a second officer who was waiting nearby. This officer, unlike the others, was wearing plain clothes and looked out of place in the police facility. His eyes scanned the room before falling on James. "You're coming with us," the plainclothes officer said, his voice low but firm. "No questions." James's stomach twisted. This wasn't what he had been expecting. He was supposed to be moving to a different facility, where he would be safe, where he could figure out his next steps. But this felt like a trap. His instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The officers surrounded him, and before James could ask another question, they were moving him through the heavy doors and into a dark, windowless van waiting outside. The van's engine rumbled to life as they shoved him inside. The door slammed shut with a cold finality. The inside of the van was cramped, the air stale and thick with tension. The plainclothes officer sat across from him, watching him intently. His eyes never left James as the van began to roll out of the parking lot. "What is this?" James asked, his voice shaking slightly, though he tried to keep it steady. "Where are you taking me?" The officer didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out a small device, tapping something on it before putting it back in his jacket. James's suspicion grew. Who are these people? The van drove for what felt like an eternity, winding through narrow streets and dark alleys. James was unable to get any sense of direction, and with every minute that passed, his anxiety only increased. He thought about Harper's words, "Stay calm. Keep your head down." But this didn't feel like the plan he had been promised. There was no way he could stay calm now. Something was terribly wrong. The officer glanced at James one last time before speaking. "This is your last chance to back out, soldier. Stay quiet, and we'll get you where you need to be. Make a scene, and you'll never get out." James's mind raced. Was he being handed over to a different group entirely? Was this some kind of setup? The more he thought about it, the more the pieces didn't add up. He had trusted Harper, but now everything felt like it was slipping out of control. The van turned down a dirt road, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. James's heart pounded in his chest as he strained to see through the small, grimy windows. The van slowed as they approached an old, abandoned building. It looked like something out of a nightmare, dark, uninviting, and surrounded by tall metal fences. The vehicle came to a halt. The engine died, and the door opened slowly. One of the officers stepped out, and then, with a cold look, turned back toward James. "Time to get out," the officer said. James didn't move at first, his mind screaming for answers. But there were none. He had to act fast. Whatever was going on, he couldn't just sit back and wait. As the officers opened the door, James lunged forward, his body fueled by panic. He shoved the officer closest to him and scrambled out of the van before they could react. His feet hit the ground, and he immediately started running. The night air burned in his lungs, and his heart pounded in his chest. Behind him, the officer shouted, but James didn't slow down. He didn't know where he was going, but he had no choice but to escape. As he ran through the dark streets, fear and adrenaline surged through him. He couldn't stop now. If they caught him, it would all be over. But if he could just stay one step ahead, maybe, just maybe, he could find a way out of this nightmare. The sound of footsteps grew louder behind him, and James's breath became more ragged. He could hear them closing in. He had no time to think, no time to plan. But then, in the distance, he saw headlights, bright and blinding. A car. His heart skipped. Could it be Marcus? Was it the help Harper promised? The car screeched to a halt, and before James could even take a step toward it, the door flew open. "Get in," a voice shouted from the car. Without hesitation, James dove inside, slamming the door behind him just as the officers reached the car. "Drive," the voice commanded. The car sped off, leaving the officers behind in the dust. James could barely breathe, his heart still racing from the chase. He turned to the driver, hoping it was Marcus. But the figure behind the wheel was someone he didn't recognize. "Who are you?" James gasped, trying to catch his breath. James could barely process the chaos unfolding around him. His heart was still pounding from the close call, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the car sped down the dark, desolate road. The mysterious driver's face remained hidden in the shadows, but the urgency in his voice was undeniable. "We can't stay on this route for long," the driver said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "They'll be after us. We need to move quickly." James nodded, though he wasn't sure who they were. The officers chasing him. The people behind his arrest. He still had so many unanswered questions, but one thing was certain. He couldn't let his guard down now. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional glance exchanged between James and the driver. As they approached a wooded area, the driver suddenly slowed, making a sharp turn onto a narrow, overgrown path. The headlights illuminated a small, hidden cabin ahead. The driver pulled up beside it, cutting the engine and leaving them in darkness. "Get out. We're safe for now," the driver said, his eyes scanning the surroundings before he gestured for James to follow. James's legs were stiff as he stepped out of the car. He hadn't realized how much tension he was holding in his body until the pressure of the escape started to ease. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that they were walking into a trap. The driver led him inside the cabin, which appeared abandoned but surprisingly well maintained. The inside was dimly lit by a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. A table in the center of the room held stacks of papers and a few folders. None of them looked ordinary. "Who are you?" James finally asked, his voice hoarse. "And why are you helping me?" The driver locked the door behind them, turning to face him. "My name is Agent Blake. I'm part of a special operations team that has been monitoring your situation closely. You've been caught in the middle of something far bigger than you realize." James's breath caught in his throat. Special operations team. Monitoring him. His mind reeled, trying to piece together what was happening. "Monitoring me," James echoed, his confusion deepening. "What do you mean? What's going on? Why me?" Blake motioned for him to sit at the table. "We don't have much time, but I'll explain as quickly as I can. You were arrested because you stumbled onto something you weren't supposed to. Something connected to a covert operation, tied to powerful people at the Pentagon." James's stomach turned. The Pentagon again. It felt like a shadow that loomed over everything he had been through. "What covert operation?" he asked, his voice low with disbelief. Blake sat down across from him, pulling a folder from the stack and sliding it across the table. "This operation involves a classified project that's been going on for years. It's a conspiracy to hide massive corruption and illegal activities within high levels of government. People with influence at the Pentagon have been using their positions for personal gain, and they've gone to great lengths to keep it covered up." James stared at the folder, the weight of Blake's words sinking in. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the folder, his mind racing with questions. Corruption at the Pentagon? Could this really be true? But why was I involved? I'm just a veteran. I don't know anything about government conspiracies. Blake sighed. "You were at the wrong place at the wrong time. A few months ago, during your time in the military, you were unknowingly assigned to a task force that uncovered a small piece of the puzzle. They realized that you might have seen something you didn't even know was important." James's mind flashed back to his service, trying to remember anything that could have tipped off the authorities. But nothing stood out. He had always followed orders, always done his job without question. "So they arrested me because I might have seen something?" James asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. "But why the lies? Why the fake charges? Why not just talk to me?" Blake leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "They couldn't risk you speaking out. They couldn't take the chance that you'd remember something vital. So they created a reason to keep you quiet, to discredit you. Your arrest wasn't a mistake, James. It was part of a larger plan to silence anyone who could expose them." The realization hit James like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just a pawn in some random mistake. He had been targeted because of what he could expose. He had been a threat to powerful people. People who had made sure he wouldn't talk. Blake's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "We have a plan to take them down, but it's going to take time. We need you to stay hidden for now. Keep your head down and don't trust anyone. We're gathering evidence, and we'll bring it all to light." James sat back, the weight of everything crashing down on him. His life had turned upside down in ways he couldn't have imagined, and now he was involved in something so much bigger than he had ever signed up for. Blake stood up, moving toward the back of the cabin, where a map was pinned on the wall. "We have a few days before they realize you've escaped, but we need to move quickly. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to expose them." James nodded, trying to digest everything. He was no longer just a man trying to clear his name. He was now part of a much larger fight, one that would require everything he had to bring the truth to light. "I'm in," he said, his voice steady with newfound resolve. "Let's bring them down." Blake gave him a curt nod. "Good. Because the battle's just begun. We don't have time for questions. Just trust me and hold on, the driver said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. We're not out of danger yet.